info. So in this workshop, we will explore how we can expose and familiarize students with other cultures while practicing culturally responsive teaching and developing intercultural skills. So join us in discussing methods, goals, and practices in promoting multiculturalism and intercultural competency. And Megumi will go over the outline real quickly.
Okay, Janine, your internet seems kind of unstable, so maybe you can check that a little bit while I go over the outline of our workshop today, how it will be flowing for the next 90 minutes or so. So first we'll be starting with a little time for introducing ourselves, getting to know each other, and then moving on to talking about the terms of interculturalism and multiculturalism so that we can go on to the discussions that we have in our workshops. Also, we'll be talking about how this question, how culturally aware is our society? Janine and I will be giving our examples of what we think about this from our experience so that you can kind of think about your own experience and reflect on that to be discussing that with our peers we have today. And in the middle, we have this little poll activity that you will be also participating with us to kind of reflect back on what we've been exposed to in our past during our school years. And again, just like the little terms of culturally responsive teaching, to go into the scenario activity at the end that we have to talk about the big question we have of this workshop. Also, after the workshop, there'll be a debrief session after several minutes of break. This is an optional session, so feel free if you would like to chat with us about the workshop or just any feedback you would have for us. We would love to be seeing you here at this session.
So going into our quick icebreaker introduction, we'll just have the simple main questions of your name, where you grew up, where you live now, and current studies or profession. We have an optional question to get you thinking about some of the topics that we'll cover in the workshop. You don't have to answer if you don't feel comfortable. If you don't want to speak on camera, you can always just type them in the chat so we can all get to know each other a little bit. Like I said, my name is Janine. I was born in Germany because my father was German, but I grew up in a border town between the US and Mexico in the United States because my mother was Mexican American, and currently I'm living in Oulu, Finland, studying education and globalization. I guess Megumi wants to introduce herself next.
Okay, sorry, I thought you froze, sorry about that. Hello, my name is Megumi, which is a typical name in my home country, which is Japan. I was born in Japan, but I spent several years living in London when I was younger, where I went to primary school and secondary school there. And now I live in Oulu. I study at this University of Oulu as a first-year master's student in education and globalization. And I'll be talking more about this later, but I feel like I grew up in both a multicultural and a homogeneous community in the two of the countries that I've lived in. So if anyone would like to follow me to introduce themselves, it will be nice to hear from you.
Well, I can. That's fine. Okay. Yeah. Hi, Elina. Grew up in Finland, living here as well. I'm a student from the University of Oulu. I do substitute teach occasionally, so if that counts for a profession. I feel that I grew up in an environment or a community where there could have been more awareness of the multicultural nature of that community than there was. So it was shown as if it was a homogeneous community, but it wasn't.
Well, perhaps. Oh, sorry. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, okay, I can go. So I'm Natalia. I grew up in Brazil and I live in Oulu, Finland now. I studied in the master program of education and globalization, and I'm a teacher. And about multicultural environment, I think I can say that yes, in terms that Brazil is a very multicultural country within itself, not like that we have many immigrants, for example. So it's not multicultural in the sense of something very global, but within Brazil, there are so many cultures. So in that sense, I think I was surrounded by a multicultural environment. However, I think that until I went to the university, I was in a very closed environment in Brazil. Like the people who I had contact with, they were all just like me, and everything was very similar. So I think that in that sense, like I saw multiculturalism happening outside of my bubble, but I was living in this bubble where everything was very homogeneous, I would say.
Thank you for sharing that. Is there anyone else who'd like to go next?
Well, I can continue. Hi, my name is Nora, and I grew up mostly in Finland, but also partly in the UK, in Yorkshire, and then in Pittsburgh in the United States. Now I live in Oulu, Finland, and I study intercultural teacher education, like many people here. And I was actually going to comment something similar to Elina as like regarding the community, where I feel like the community I grew up in is often regarded as homogeneous, but I feel that there it is in fact very multicultural. Nice to meet you all, or see many of you from earlier workshops as well.
Would anyone else like to introduce themselves?
I might go next. So I'm Giacomo and I live in Oulu, and second year education and globalization student. I grew up in Italy and in a little town in northern Italy, and I realized that it was really a monocultural microcosm. So after growing up, I really felt the desire and the need to escape from there, and through education and my studies and then my working experiences later, I really tried to see the world as it was outside of that monocultural. I say monocultural because there was little diversity in that context. We were all, most of us were from families of Northern Italian or Italian origin, and there was little diversity in language origins and backgrounds. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. Anyone else before we move on?
I could introduce myself. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm Alex. I originally come from Budapest, Hungary. I grew up there, although I also lived in Baltimore, Maryland for about 8 months when I was in my early 20s. And I would say I grew up in a pretty homogeneous context, but now, oh, actually, I'm a student here at the University of Oulu. I also study intercultural education. And with that said, now having studied intercultural education and reflecting on my childhood, I realized that it was a lot more multicultural than I was aware of at the time. but this narrative of a very homogeneous Hungarian culture was promoted, even though there were a lot of people there who were actually refugees, immigrants, and whatnot.
Thank you. It's been very interesting so far to hear all the different backgrounds. Next, we go into the aim of this workshop, which Megumi will explain.
So thank you everyone who shared all your introduce yourselves and in the chats as well. It's all nice to see you all here. So in this workshop, as we have here, we aim to promote understanding and interaction between us from different backgrounds and discuss issues and the different opinions that we have. And also, Janine and I, we have this burning question on this topic, but of course we're not professionals in this field, so I'm really excited to be learning from you and with all of you today during this workshop. Okay, so let's start from the terms of multiculturalism and interculturalism to kind of get us started here. Just a quick question I have. So would anyone like to, I guess, because we have lots of people who studied intercultural teachings and things, if there's anything that you know about multiculturalism and interculturalism, and if you think there's a difference between these, and perhaps maybe even if you think culture is multicultural or intercultural. Just a quick question if anyone would like to have something to answer this. Maybe Elena?
Yeah, well, often I feel like people use these words quite interchangeably, or use one word and mean the other. But my basic grasp is that multiculturalism as a term tends to maybe highlight the differences and understanding differences, while interculturalism for me is more about finding connections.
Thank you, Elena. Yeah, that's a really good point about looking at the differences. That's something that I also wanted to share after this. Maybe is there anyone else? Good.
Yeah, that also was my understanding, as Elena was saying. These words can be used in quite interchangeably. I read that perhaps multiculturalism is more common in the US and interculturalism in Europe. And anyway, as Elena said, I like interculturalism because it also gives you the idea of different cultures that are connecting to each other in an open dialogue, interacting. While multiculturalism sometimes is more perceived as the coexistence of different cultures that actually don't communicate to each other, even though it can be meant in the same meaning of interculturalism. Yeah.
Thank you, Giacomo. Yes, I think you summarized it really well for me. So a lot of things that I was planning to talk about. We have something by Alex. Yeah, maybe the words are different. The common words that are used may be different between countries, which I'm not aware of, but of course could be possible. Well, when Janine and I were looking at these terms, we found this article by Portera, which was talking about multicultural and intercultural. So we would want to use this to kind of introduce you today. And so when talking about these terms, there's also the terms of metaculturalism and transculturalism, which I'll just go through really briefly. So metaculturalism is something of a really broad term that doesn't consider any cultural differences at all. Like, we're human beings, we live on Earth, and we are together. Transculturalism stresses the common cultural standards and the values that we share, whereas multiculturalism, as Giacomo has also said, focuses on the differences that we have. For example, at home, I was born in Japan and my family's Japanese. I was raised in a typical Japanese culture. And so at home, I don't wear my shoes. I don't know, just someone. Elena, sorry, just because you were at the top of my screen. At home, do you wear your shoes in your house?
No, I don't.
Maybe in Finland you don't. How about Giacomo?
Sorry, what did you ask about the shoes?
Yes, the shoes.
If you take them off, or what? What was the answer?
Do you wear your
Okay.
shoes off in your
No,
house?
actually, I don't. That was a noticeable difference. I don't take off my shoes. People in Italy don't. Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah,
before the pandemic, I used to, but then with the pandemic, we started to take them out before entering at home.
Oh, is that for like as a culture? I wouldn't say culture, but like as a
pretty
thing,
much.
or,
it's like very common now to have people like with a box of shoes or something like that at their door in Brazil nowadays, but it wasn't before the pandemic. Like you would wear shoes normally at home.
That's interesting. I haven't heard about that actually. It's really interesting. Yeah, it's new information. Well, anyways, sorry, kind of got off track there. So, for example, for me and Elena, we don't wear shoes in our houses, but for Giacomo and Natha, well, before the COVID, you guys wear your shoes at home. So we have differences here, but I understand you, you understand me, I respect you, you respect me, you do you, I do I, so we can live peacefully together side by side. This is kind of the idea of multiculturalism. And so I would say living peacefully side by side. Whereas interculturalism, as we have in the word inter, it's more about the interactions. So not just living next to each other, but more about living together in a society by understanding both the differences and the common values that we share. So this is just the terms that we would like to introduce you about multiculturalism and interculturalism. So when looking at this term, thank you, Alex. So when looking at this term, so we have this question about, so is our society multicultural? How does our society respond to multiculturalism? And how culturally aware is our society? And so we would want all of us together to reflect on this, and just as a starting off, Janine and I have examples of this that maybe can kind of start you off with thinking about your own experiences.
Yeah, so like I had mentioned in the beginning, I grew up in the United States, and what I forgot to mention was that I did growing up in a relatively homogenous community. Since, you know, it's in the border of Mexico and the US, most of the population is Mexican. And despite the US, like as a whole, you know, being very multicultural, at least, you know, I can only speak from my experience in my region, there's still a lack of interculturalism, so like interactions between different cultures. And especially with like the history of the US has with segregation, that's also really kind of hindered that interaction. And, you know, that's increased things like the socioeconomic gap, and a lot of people who end up on the lower income are like minorities, like my communities. And so it also creates more barriers to the interaction because, you know, you go to different schools still, the children see that usually it's the white kids who have the better schools and have more resources. So it creates this kind of negative and this tension between groups as well, and kind of contributes to, you know, the system and the cycle of like racism and intolerance. This, you know, with the segregation too, and the unequal distribution of resources, there's also the lack of education. My community, it's pretty homogenous, and it's also very geographically kind of isolated from the rest of the United States and the rest of the state of Texas as well. So like Nata had mentioned where she lived, it's very much a little bubble of similar thinking, and so you don't really get much exposure to, I guess, the outside world. Like I didn't have much exposure, but once I also, you know, left my place there, like with Yakumo's experience, you know, I also started to like realize like, oh, there's these other things, and be exposed. But also because of this, you know, ignorance of other cultures and lack of understanding or opportunity to interact, this makes people much more susceptible to believing in stereotypes. For example, I had my German background, and I couldn't really hide that my father was German because of my last name. And so most of the kids would associate me or see me by the stereotypical German that you see like in the US media, with the movies, TV, and especially the video games of World War II. The kids had this fascination of this, but in school we were never actually really taught about these events. And so I was often stereotyped as like this aggressive, or they would think I was angry even if I was just, you know, just not talking. And, you know, I had a friend his mother is Mexican, but his father is African.
American.
So he looks Black, but his identity, how he identifies, he is Mexican. But since he doesn't look the, you know, the standard, how media portrays of like a Mexican, since he looks more Black, there's this pressure going to school, and just because of the assumptions of other kids, there's a pressure to fit into the identity of the stereotypical Black kid. And so, you know, especially this with media, creating assumptions and stereotypes, and it can be a useful tool for interaction exposure, but, you know, it's not quite the same as interaction, and it can feed ignorance. And I'm gonna pass it over to Megumi to talk a little bit more about her experiences.
Yeah, definitely. So as I said, from Japan. I grew up in Japan also. And I feel I'm going to be talking about Japan and England. I'm just going to be saying that because it's easier for me to talk, and but I'm not trying to generalize the whole of the community. It's just from my past experience. But I would say that Japan is a homogeneous community. I saw Junko put that also in the chat. Maybe she might agree with me also. We are in this small island country with only 2% of the residents with foreign citizenships. So I would say that we don't even have I wouldn't even see multiculturalism in my country, to be honest. And so heritage is still really important in our country, in many places, and in situations such as looking for jobs, for prestigious jobs, and the knowledge that we gain about other cultures relies on, just as similarly with the case with Janine, but relies on media. And so I would say that we're very ignorant with inappropriate stereotypes, such as, I don't know, having Black actors act as criminals in films, or having these slim, tall, white, blonde women as models as like the symbol of beauty. And England, on the other hand, I would say was more culturally diverse. It was only after I moved to England that I saw people with like different hair colors or eye colors or skin colors as me. And each class, well, at least at the school I went to, each class was full of kids from different different countries and different cultural backgrounds. And so I would say that these two countries, for me, it was really different in the context of like multiculturalism and interculturalism. But although these two countries were really different, regardless of the environment, I felt like the people inside were both unconsciously biased and were looking at things from their filters and in many ways ignorant and can be I would maybe racist or kind of discriminative in many ways. So yeah, this is just my experience that I had. That's my story.
And now we want you all to kind of have a minute to just think on your own and reflect of your own experiences. If, you know, our stories made you think of something in your own life, and keep that in mind for the activity, the discussion activity that will be coming up in about a minute. So now Megumi is going to put everyone into breakout rooms, so you can have some time to discuss.
Yes, hello, Tsuelika, if that's how you pronounce your name. I will make rooms with the 2 or 3 participants in each room, because I think the stories will be kind of personal. So I'll make smaller rooms for you all to talk about your experiences for about 10 minutes. Okay. Now I have opened the rooms. It's not working. I mean, it's working.
Hello, welcome back. We're just gonna wait about 20 more seconds for the other groups to rejoin us. Okay, it looks like everyone has come back. Does anyone want to share or start off by sharing something that you discussed in your group?
I just want to say that I really liked how Rose pointed out that by saying like multiculturalism, it doesn't mean that it's only like ethnicity or race, but also like sexual orientations or ages. All of the thing is included in like culture and like multiculturalism. I really like that.
Definitely. Oh, sorry. Yeah, we've had we've had discussions about what culture is, which I think is a really interesting point that goes on to a really big discussion as a single topic.
I think Bruno raised their hand, if you want to go.
Sure. No, I just wanted to share a bit about the culturally aware that maybe Finland is, or let's say Oulu in this case. And this is really connected to something that some ITs have heard already, that there have been a couple of research that they are researching about integration and racism and so on. And they are using a really USA-based understanding of ethnicity and race to analyze and understand this situation in the University of Oulu. And I just find it interesting that if you use a category that it's not so relevant to the place where you are placed, how do you say, sensitive or realistic it is what you see about that situation, right? So I don't know how right it is, for example, to use those categories from the States in Finland, right? And categorize, well, that's a different discussion, categorizing people. But if you need to make categories, but using like certain like structures that are not applicable to a certain context, and then draw conclusions about it, I feel that's maybe what it's happening here. And I can share on the chat maybe the research, so you all take a look and maybe draw your own opinion on what I'm meaning.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely put that in the chat if anyone else wants to learn more about that. And you bring up like a really great point of like, you know, how things are being evaluated here. And, you know, it's different countries, and even within the different communities and like the small little areas, the context is always going to be like completely different. So you bring up a very good point on that. Would anyone else like to share or build upon anything that has been said?
Maybe just one interesting point in our group with Alexander and Sebastian that we were talking about, but when we were kids, did we know that there was a national culture, the Italian culture, for example? And we actually, as kids, I think we actually knew that there was a dominant culture in our little community. So the adults world share this kind of dominant culture, and as kids we were affected by it. So for example, yes, as you were saying, in my monocultural context, at that time, as kids, we perceived that, for example, being seen as different could be very problematic. So, for example, as you were highlighting, homosexuality was perceived as something that was a taboo subject for us as kids, and we were afraid of that topic because we knew that we perceived that the adult world had a bias against homosexuality, and so it affected the world of children. And So yeah, that is, I think, something we discovered later, that we also had a national dominant culture. Yeah.
No, yeah, and I think a little bit some of what you've mentioned kind of relates a bit to the activity that we're going to have in a bit right after this. So before we move on to that, does anyone else want to share before we move on to that activity? Okay, so the next activity, talking about what we were exposed to as children and how that shaped how we interacted or viewed the world, we're going to ask you guys to reflect on your childhoods, and talk about, which stories have you heard of, like in school or like at home, like what were you exposed to? And Megumi's gonna go over the instructions real quick.
Okay, so we have made this live poll. Very simple, it's a Slido. And so if you have your phone with you, you can use this QR code. And also you can search slido.com and type in the number 262624, which we have on the slide here.
Is everyone able to see the Slido?
Yes, we can. Oh, you mean on the slide
Or
or on that
on
device?
the screen? Is it screen sharing?
Yes, we can see your screen. Thank you. If anyone has has any issues, don't hesitate to tell us so we can support you to join the Slido. And
It
so
has
this
to
is
be
really
when we
simple.
were kids, or like
It
if
doesn't.
we've heard it at all.
Yeah, if you heard it at all, when you're doing, think about where you heard them, and that'll be part of the discussion after everyone's voted.
Sorry, yes. There'll be several names of stories here. Just tick the boxes of the ones that you've heard of or you know. Very, very simple. So one person has participated too. Oh, there's a lot of Momozaros this time. Maybe because we have Giacomo and maybe Junko. And someone grabbed a lot of.
So we've had 5 answers so far.
Do you have to press submit or something?
Yes, I think you just check the boxes and click.
Okay,
You have to
sorry.
press send. I just discovered that.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you, Ross.
I'm sorry. Forgive my inaptitude, but how do I vote?
Sorry.
You scroll down and press send.
Scroll down.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Okay, how many votes are we still missing?
Maybe 2. But if everyone is done, maybe it's fine.
Yeah.
Is anyone still in the middle of voting or having any issues?
Guilty as charged. Many issues.
Maybe we can put a thumb up if we are done, like from reactions.
Oh, that's a good idea. Thank you, Elena.
Doesn't that identify the guilty parties?
That's the purpose of this workshop.
Does anyone else now have an urgent need to check more of these stories?
Yes,
Yeah.
I already went on Wikipedia about some of them.
Okay, I think we're ready with this then.
Yes, and if anyone still wants to vote, they can still do that while we have the discussion. So first, is there anything that has stood out to you of the results? Anything that you've noticed or anything you want to comment on?
Actually, I was thinking because like Hansel and Gretel in Portuguese, it has nothing to do with that. It's João and Maria. So I was thinking like, if there is any of those others that just have a very different name from the name in Portuguese, and maybe I know the story, but I have no idea that I know the story just because the name's very different.
That happened to me also. Some I just didn't recognize the name, but did know the story. Is it the same story though, with just different names?
Yeah, it's the same story. They just changed the names because Hansel and Gretel are like, I don't think people would be able to even pronounce those names. They chose very common Brazilian names for it.
Yeah, it seems like we have these things in most countries then. In Hungary too.
Did anyone have any thoughts while they were filling out the survey or anything you've noticed?
For me, the stories at the top, they're the ones that I recognize. And they're all sort of warning stories. Don't go into forests, don't be alone, don't have a young relationship. They're all kind of scary, keep you in line stories. So now I'm wondering if the ones that I'm not familiar with have the same kind of meanings.
That's a really good point that we haven't had.
Yes, we haven't thought of that. I think some of the stories that many did not know, at least the ones that I am familiar with, some of them do have different messages than the ones at the top. But yeah, that is a good point that we hadn't thought of either before.
Yeah. I'm surprised Confucius this time is 0.
Yeah. I know El Coco is like a legend. I know like with a Mexican or Latin American culture, it's more of like the parents will tell the children to behave or else, you know, the monster is going to get them. And the stories like the Paul Bunyan, that was during the time in the United States of like the westward expansion, which instead of saying, you know, don't go into the forest, it's basically, yeah, he goes into the forest and chops down all the trees. But one thing that Megan and I had noticed when we were like doing research and also like from our courses and stuff and talking to classmates is that a lot of the stories that we see that most people know come from a Western or European origin. And for example, I believe when we were looking, The Butterfly Lovers was a similar story, but from Chinese origin. And I think if anyone correct me if I'm incorrect on this, it was pretty much like Romeo and Juliet, except much older. Yet the story that most people know is the one from Shakespeare. And so that we're looking at, you know, also like education, for example. My mother, like I said, I lived in a very pretty much mostly Mexican community. And my mother, when she went to school, most of the teachers were white Americans, and the stories that they were taught in school were things like this: Hansel and Gretel, Honest Abe, Johnny Appleseed, or the types of stories from the white colonial times when you had the settlers coming in and settling down in the US, which is not, you know, from our like Mexican culture. We didn't learn the stories from like our culture or families. And so that was like pretty interesting. And that kind of also shows some of the remnants of, you know, the attempts of like assimilation of, you know, the non-white populations, at least in the United States. And also, when I went to school, not much had changed. The Western or European stories were still the ones that they taught me in school, which, and so this relates to going into our topic of, you know, like culturally responsive teaching. But before we go off into that part, would anyone like to add anything?
Thanks, this was a thought-provoking exercise.
Thank you. Okay.
So I think it just shows that we actually miss out on more than we get.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many more that I've never heard of than I've actually been exposed to. So I think we miss out a lot.
Yeah.
With some of this, I'm wondering, like, because I had the initial idea that it would be nice to, for example, as a teacher, to share these stories with the children in a classroom. But then I'm wondering, would I or would they understand it without a connection to the culture of origin in these stories? I guess some parts would be clear, but some would be misinterpreted. So
yeah, I think that's a good question to think about.
Like stories and media can help us create some kind of connections to cultures we are not familiar with, but then other times it doesn't go as planned.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that is the role of the teacher in facilitating the contact of students with these stories. I mean, I didn't grow up in Europe, and I can connect with Hansel and Gretel. Like, there was some kind of facilitation to this world. So, like Little Red Riding Hood, same thing. Like, for me, it's like unthinkable that a child would be walking in a forest. And then when I got here, kids are walking in the forest all the time. And I was like, oh, now it makes sense, all the stories that I heard. But yeah, like, you can connect somehow.
We have greetings from Sebastian's family, I guess. Hello.
Yeah, here you got 2 for 1. Both graduated from Ed Glow.
Oh, hello.
That's so cool.
Yeah. And Nora's dog also.
Oh, he was saying hi to Sebastian's child.
Hello.
If
Also, oh, sorry.
oh no, go ahead.
So also what's interesting is, well, when I was looking at this, I barely knew any of the stories that we had, just like the top 3 perhaps, and of course Momotaro, which is a really famous story in Japan about a boy who's born from a peach and goes and fight ogres. But the thing is that all these traditional folktales that we know in our country isn't really in textbooks, and what are in the textbooks are more of like stories from different countries, or I would say Western countries. So that was something that I realized when I was looking through this list, which I think is really interesting too.
Yes. And I think, like Megumi mentioned in the chat, we had several participants from the US in the last workshop. And well, I had, when I went to school, we were taught all these, American folk tales. They who lived in a more like, your standard white American communities had actually not been taught these stories as much as where I went to school. So we thought that was a rather interesting difference. But going on to the concept of culturally responsive teaching, we have, as like we talked about before, context. It changes depending on where we are. So the issues that culturally responsive teaching would address, or what it needs to address, might be different in different places, even within like the same country or like community. And so we have 2 definitions of what culturally responsive teaching is. And the first one, it's from a journal article in the British Journal of Education Psychology. And so this defines culturally responsive teaching as developing a culturally diverse knowledge base by learning about differences in communication and learning styles and attending to unique cultural qualities of the students and their realities. Another definition that differs slightly comes from the context of the United States. And here it's defined as connecting academics to students' daily lives, cultural backgrounds, and concerns in ways that support engagement, achievement, and empowerment. So the second one is a little bit more about, as you see, like empowerment, a little bit more dynamic in its intent and what it's trying to address. And the first one is a little bit more, focusing on like the knowledge base and attending to the needs of students more maybe in the curriculum sense. And, that's just how I've kind of am seeing it. Of course, like we have it there for you all to come to your own conclusions and kind of think about the definitions and how they can be applied in different contexts. So now that we've gone over this, we have a quick scenario to go over and one last discussion activity, and Megumi will read the scenario right now.
Okay, if you could read along with me maybe. So a scenario. A primary school wants to show it exercises culturally responsive teaching, which we put CRT for this scenario. The head of the school with some other staff create a presentation. All teachers are then mandated to share this presentation with their students. The PowerPoint shows different countries and briefly introduces their traditional or cultural food, clothing, and language. After this presentation, teachers are not given the opportunity to provide feedback on the effectiveness. No further culturally responsive teaching initiatives are discussed, and topic is dropped.
And so we're going to ask you to think about that scenario and, considering your experiences in the school setting, how you can relate to this scenario, and also the topics that we've discussed throughout this workshop, and, consider what can be done to achieve culture responsive teaching, and how can we, answer like, why is it even like so important? And Megumi is going to put everyone into breakout rooms.
Yes, I put the text in the chat, and I'll also put this question in the chat for you to be able to see this in the breakout rooms. I will recreate the breakout rooms about 4 in each group. Yes, we have this question about the CRT yesterday also. Usually we use it as the critical race theory. We just put it as, we just put CRT for the,
Yes, because it has been used like for different things. So that goes back into the context and the complexities of all that. But thank you for pointing that out.
Yes. Sorry for the confusion with that. Okay, I have made 3 breakout rooms. I hope it's working. Hope it's open to everyone.
Yeah, they're open.
I forgot to say how long they would have, which I would broadcast right now.
Okay, so to finish on time, we'd have to do, on time is at 35. If we give 20 minutes, we'd be finishing at like 33. So do you want to tell them we'll call them back at 30? And then we can have the group discussion.
Okay, I'll say around 20 minutes.
Okay. Okay, so I hope you all had like fruitful discussions. Does anyone want to share what you discussed in your groups, or maybe new questions that you have, or something that stood out to you or you would like to share?
Well, what I have on my mind right now is that like training teachers to be culturally like aware is important, but so is understanding different contexts and kind of like starting points, that in some situations it's more important to first check that you have like a very basic space, safe space, and kind of like that makes me think about how university circles sometimes feel like, well, this is very nice and great, but this won't be applicable to my classroom as it is. Like, this won't be the level of conversation that we're having, because people won't be opening their mouths out of the fear that they will be called slurs. So it's like you have to start somewhere, and sometimes the university discussions will start from quite far away from the daily life.
Thank you for sharing. Does anyone else want to add to that?
Maybe going on from Elena, having workshops with in-service teachers and looking at transforming things in schools, the conclusion that I've come to and what I recommend is working on things that you can change, rather than wasting energy at a time or putting yourself in danger, or working on things that you can't change. It doesn't mean that you have to stop them, but forever, but maybe that's not the right time or place, and that can come later. But focusing on what you can change and what you can do also sets you up for success.
Thank you. Also, to give some more context to the scenario that we gave, this is something that actually did happen with my old elementary school that I used to go to, and this was about a year ago that this scenario or this occurred actually. And I guess, does anyone, were there any experiences or anything that you could relate to the topics or things that we have discussed in the workshop, or something else that someone would like to share that maybe you didn't get a chance to before?
Well, we were at quite a cliffhanger in our breakout room. So if Ross and Sebastian have time, maybe we could still have a tiny breakout room session to hear the rest of the story. But
yeah, that would be nice. I would like that.
Yes. Let's see. So going into breakout rooms again, or?
Can you tell us the story?
I am curious about the story.
Maybe someone would like to also hear the story.
Nora, you can judge if you want to share with everybody here.
Oh, I don't really know if it's like well, it's very personal. Also, I don't know if it directly relates to culturally responsive teaching, but it was related to how, well, Sebastian asked I think a very good question for Elena and me, who both study in the Intercultural teacher education program, and he just asked if we felt that it had a contributor. Do you want to repeat the question actually, Sebastian? I'm not sure if I'd be like if this would be the space for me to share my answer, but but yeah, I think it would be nice to hear that question again.
I was just curious. If I know you guys have been in the program for a few years, and if there is anything practical or theoretical or otherwise that you have learned that you think that you could bring into your classroom once you become a teacher, related to obviously how you would approach multiculturalism, cross-cultural communication in the classroom. Because I know cultural awareness is one thing. It's one thing to be aware about other cultures, and everybody's aware of other cultures. But the question is, what are you going to do about it, right? So it's not just being aware of other cultures, it's how are you going to use this resource of having, rich, different cultures in the classroom in order to, enhance and enrich the classroom setting. That's why I wanted to know if there was anything that you guys have, learned while you've been studying in the program.
Well, I can happily say that there is something, like, to answer, like, is there anything? There are some things. But yeah, Bruno, I agree. What a question.
I think that is a good burning question for us all to think about. Does anyone else have any last comments or stories or something they would like to add for everyone to hear before we move to the wrap up?
Yeah, I agree that that's a great question. And I think everyone, well, of course, all of us can ponder about it, like like regarding our own programs, whatever you're studying, or if you are studying something, I think that's still a good question. And especially in the IT context, I think if someone feels that that's not the case, that they have not like gotten those things in the program, then I think it would be a very good idea to ask why. Although I also personally feel that it has definitely helped me grow in this regard, I suppose. Don't know if that made any sense. But yeah, I feel like maybe the culturally responsive teaching as of right now, I don't have anything else to add.
Thank you, Nura. Anyone else? Okay, so you were also going to ask everyone if you had any burning questions that this workshop maybe inspired in you. I see we did have some already that have been shared. Does anyone want to share if there are any other burning questions, or, you know, if there are any takeaways that you want to talk about in the wrap up before we conclude this workshop?
Well, let's say my burning questions after the breakout room, and also studying decoloniality especially, is like, we were talking in the breakout room about the opportunity for the students to engage with different cultures so that they can feel engaged, excited about, they can feel this is something new for them, this is something unique that can become part of their work. And in a way, the thing is that I would like to imagine that by studying different cultures, we also develop the skill to go beyond the cultures, and to see that beyond the cultures, there is actually what can be called like existential common ground. It's a definition that I found in an article that I liked after that. Like, going beyond the culture, students can perceive that they actually just share an existential common ground. Well, this is actually very difficult to communicate or to teach, but it's something that will be my aim as a teacher.
Definitely. And just to be respectful of everyone's time as well, we're gonna wrap things up now, but if you would still like to have some discussions or, you know, have feedback, once we wrap up, we're gonna have like a 10-minute break, and we'll have the debrief session for those who'd like to stick around for that. But thank you so much for everyone's time and for attending, and it was great hearing from everyone and learning about your perspectives and experiences. And we hope that you were able to get something out of this workshop. And I hope everyone has a good rest of their day or night, wherever you're currently. And thank you again.
And yeah, also if we could take a group photo at the end, which might be able to use, if anyone's okay. If they don't feel comfortable, feel free to turn your cameras off.
Or